Bought a mine from BHP, did you, Carol? That's the big Australian selling some stuff in North America. I wanted to talk in general terms about emissions and how much they're going to cost to be controlled, how much we save, apparently, if we do control these emissions. First off, though, I think it's important just to bear in mind the quantity of emissions, or basically the share of different emissions. We generally talk about energy, especially electricity, but I think it's important to bear in mind that of the emissions of carbon dioxide and its equivalent, energy is only about a quarter as a whole. The rest come from transport, from industry, from agriculture, from forestry, and so on. The source of energy preference, certainly for most policymakers, is renewable power, which fundamentally means wind. And if we look in terms of wind, the various types of energy from electricity, these are Australian costs. They differ a little bit from other costs, but not massively so. We can see here that black coal, basically, and brown coal, we can generate electricity for under $40 per megawatt hour. Wind is far higher than that, at around $120 per hour. Now, according to the US, is slightly different. According to EIA data, the US has wind much closer to fossil fuels, but that's because they bend the data somewhat. They have a different interest rate they use for wind in assessing its costs, and they actually do incorporate a carbon tax, even though there isn't a carbon tax in the US at present time, at $21 per megawatt hour. Australia similarly has a renewable energy tax. Basically, it operates through requiring retailers to incorporate a certain amount of renewable energy within the total amount that they supply, and the tax effect of that currently stands at about $43, which is about $35 per megawatt hour in the $35 US per megawatt hour. It can rise much higher. In addition to the premium that wind requires, because it is so much more expensive, there is also a backup requirement for wind because of its episodic nature. And that differs a little bit with the system. If for example, in Ontario, with about 24% of hydro, they can take a lot of wind before incurring cost, because the hydro and the wind tend to offset each other, and fast start generation is readily available through hydro. Where it's scarcer, of course, the costs do rise. This chart actually looks at the backup required in the UK for wind generation, and in addition, once wind reaches about 15%, about 18% increase in capacity is required for the system as a whole. UK wind is slightly under 10% at the present time, and the authors of this report, which is the UK Energy Research Centre, suggested that it adds about $11 per megawatt hour, about 10% in the UK to the cost of wind by having that backup. We have a similar system in Australia requiring backup. It's based on insurance, and that also people buy what they call a cap. The price of electricity in Australia is market determined. It can go to very high rates, up to $13,500 per megawatt hour, which is 100-fold the normal rate. Those people who are involved in electricity are very keen to ensure they do keep the costs down or keep themselves covered. The bottom line from this, in terms of renewables, is that we can actually get quite a high proportion of renewables within electricity, maybe even as high as 30%. But to do so, we do have to incur these additional costs. Electricity, compared to coal or gas, is 4 or 5 times the price. After 30%, it becomes utterly prohibitive, because then you've got to talk in terms of batteries and other storage to actually even out the the normal the normal progression of daily generations and the oscillations in the amount of power which is actually presented. There was a suggestion yesterday that from an excellent presentation by Howard Hayden, who said, well, renewables will never displace coal or will displace fossil plant, but in fact that's not actually true, because we have seen in Australia, even in the last week or so, that 2 major coal plants, fairly large plants, have now closed down because of the influence of wind in one state in South Australia. If we go back to this chart, even if we are talking about wind and renewables, we are still only talking about that small quarter energy supply in the purple there. It's very difficult to actually think in terms of how we replace the greenhouse gas emitting activities for cars and boats and planes. And in agriculture, for example, it's about 14%, and the reduction requires some very improbable breakthroughs in preventing cattle from belching and ceasing to use nitrogen as fertilizer. In the case of industry, 19%, and a lot of that is making plastics and chemicals, iron and steel, etc. Bear this in mind generally, what we're talking about in terms of the overall pattern for Western economies, that we do need to reduce, if we are to abide by the prohibitions and the standards of the IPCC, we do need to reduce our emissions to 20% of those which are presently prevailing. And this makes it a very, very difficult proposition indeed. In terms of global activity, we can see that the renewable capacity which is feasible at the present time is wind, essentially, which is the deeper green one. That level of investment in wind seems to have peaked, or at least asymptoted, in the last few years. And the share, whilst it reaches 10% and plus in some European markets, 2% roughly in the US, it is much lower in the rapidly developing Asian markets. And we can see in terms of some of the forecasts, in order to meet some of the demand, we can see colossal numbers. $230 billion a year is the IEA's, the OECD scenario for 2030, massive increases in spending. So, having looked at that scenario and the difficulties of actually achieving these things, one of the key question to my mind in this agenda is what are the costs of climate change, and what are the losses of abatement that are avoided. We've got a number of studies, famous studies of the costs. I guess one of the most famous is Stern in the UK, and it's an Australian version by a guy called Garneau. And these estimate very high costs from climate change. Stern suggested that the costs of human-induced climate change would be, and he quoted the equivalent of around 20% reduction in consumption per head now and in the future. I'm not quite sure what that meant, but he said that it's 20%. And combating this, according to Stern, would have been just 1% of GDP. In Australia, Garneau had similar sorts of numbers, 12%, and similar sorts of costs, he said. But when you start examining some of these, the rationales of these costs, they get difficult to substantiate. For example, Garneau suggests that one cost would result from lower tourism spending, because he said that the Great Barrier Reef, an iconic tourist and ecological system on the east coast of Australia, would collapse as a result of global warming, which is almost certainly not true, but even so, there are bigger problems for tourism in the scenario of these very high costs impositions on energy than the collapse of some of the places where people might want to visit. Gano also thought that there'd be a lot of climate refugees, which would require increased spending on military things. When, in fact, the outcome of this has been that the IPCC has adjusted these numbers and doesn't think anymore that there will be such climate refugees. Gano and others have also suggested, well, also that there's going to be a collapse in rainfall as a result of climate change. And that was evocative in Australia a few years ago because we faced several years of drought. And this is the area which is the main irrigation area in Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin. But as you can see, if you look at the long term, there's massive oscillations in amount of rainfall, but there's no trend, in fact a slight trend upwards, in terms of the amount. So the costs that these people suggest are very high. But then the IPCC was more grounded than that. They looked at various studies, peer-reviewed studies, Nordhaus, Basello, Rosen and van der Mensberg, and they looked at, what would the cost be? They looked at all the scenarios that people put forward about there'll be more disease, or there'll be fewer, the wheat won't flower as rapidly, etc. And they added them all up. Nordhaus is quite a famous study. He said, well, if the warming is 3 degrees centigrade, he worked out that there would be a loss. This is a loss over 100 years or so of 2.5% of GDP. Now, that isn't all that much. 2.5% of GDP, a loss over 100 years, that's about half a year's normal growth in GDP. This is what we're talking about averting. The bottom line is we're averting this much with the measures that we are intending to put in place. And indeed, that's a very controversial number because a lot of people, including people at this conference, have pointed out that the adverse circumstances which are being measured by that 2.5% or even as much as 4.6% won't occur. In fact, the warming or the increased carbon dioxide would lead to a fertilization effect, there'd be more food, and et cetera, et cetera. So against that, these are the costs that we're actually saving. What is it going to cost us to get to these savings? And there's a massive amount of chart. This is a rather complex one. And it's a distillation of an even more complex one of the IPCC. But one of the costs is this cost here. This is the essential one. This is what the IPCC says it will cost us: 3.4% of GDP to do all these massive changes in our energy sources, to move away from coal and from petroleum, etc., into these renewables. A mere 3.4%. But if you actually look at what they're saying, they've actually got a whole lot they've got a whole lot of technological developments that they're assuming will take place in terms of higher productivity for wind, in terms of we're going to be substituting our existing coal for carbon capture and storage, some technology which is theoretical. It means you've got to take the carbon dioxide, you've got to gather it together, you've got to pipe it underground, you've got to hold it underground. All of this is feasible, but there is no such plant that can do this in the world in any sense at the present time. So, the estimates they have made in terms of this 3.4%, or even around 10%, if some of the technologies that they suggest aren't going to come through, are very difficult to sympathise with. And indeed, once what we can see in terms of economies, even Australia, which we had a carbon tax for a little while, we saw a collapse in the demand for electricity. We saw industries departing and moving overseas to where there was no such tax. What we're talking about is that the cost overall to human beings, which is the main cost we should be interested in, of doing nothing, even on the most pessimistic circumstances that the IPCC uses, won't be very great. But the disruption costs, which we've seen from time to time, would be quite colossal. So this is the bottom line. The costs aren't much we incur. The actual costs that we would incur in preventing these things are very much greater. And all of these developments do depend on a near unanimity in terms of nations across the world. It's no good one nation, it's no good even one group of nations. Almost every nation has to adopt the same sort of policy, because if they don't, then the industries which are energy intensive will migrate to those nations that don't do so, and the outcome will be trivial in terms of the consequences, so there would be no reduction anyway. And what we've seen in recent years is that China and India are bucking the trend. They're basically saying that they will not agree to curtailing their emissions in the same way that the Western world is advocating. They will not do so, at least until they've arrived at the standard of living that the rest of the world has had. So that also is a major frustrating case that it cannot be done. So my story is that this is not an expensive outcome if in fact we see an increased temperature levels, and many people suggest these temperature levels that are projected there are grossly overstated. That the cost will not be great. The cost would be great for the disruption involved, and the political feasibility is almost inconceivable unless you can get 190 nations across the globe all agreeing to the same sort of policy, and we won't get that. At the present time, we really only have the European Union, which is agreeing to that policy. We do have the Obama administration, which would like to agree to it, but it is curtailed from doing so by the legislature in the United States. So it's not going to be costly. It's not even going to be possible. When do we sort of wake up and say, let's abandon this policy? Thank you.